Today, what I'm going to tell you is not just a history story. It is actually one of the clearest ways to understand today's world. But before we begin, let me say this. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because what you are about to hear is not just something that happened in the past. It is a reflection of the system we still live in today. In July of 1789, a furious crowd in Paris stormed the Bastille. They weren't storming it for liberty alone. They were storming it because the financial system that kept their country alive had collapsed. For years, France's monarchy had pretended it was eternal, wrapped in pageantry, wealth, and divine right. But beneath the chandeliers of Versailles, the French state was bankrupt. The revolution did not begin with philosophy. It began with debt, inflation, and bread that cost more than wages. The guillotine was not forged in iron. It was forged in ledgers. And if you think this is just history, think again. Because the same mistakes that destroyed the French monarchy, reckless borrowing, unfair taxation, and paper money spiraling into worthlessness, still echo in today's financial system. Let's rewind to the 18th century. France was one of the wealthiest and most powerful nations in Europe, with nearly 30 million people, fertile farmland, and global ambitions. But it had a structural problem. Its financial system was archaic, corrupt, and incapable of managing modern power. While Britain had created the Bank of England in 1694 and developed a bond market that allowed it to finance wars with remarkable efficiency, France clung to older systems. Taxes were collected not directly by the state, but by private tax farmers who paid the king a lump sum for the right to extract revenue. These collectors squeezed peasants mercilessly and pocketed the difference. Offices were sold to the wealthy as a form of investment, creating a parasitic bureaucracy more focused on protecting privilege than serving the public. The result was a state that bled money at the top while suffocating its base. The wars of the 18th century exposed these weaknesses. The War of Austrian Succession in the 1740s, the 7 Years' War in the 1750s, and especially France's intervention in the American Revolution in the 1770s, piled debt onto the monarchy. Supporting the American colonies against Britain may have looked like sweet revenge, but it was financial suicide. By the early 1780s, the French crown had borrowed more than 1 billion livres to fund the conflict. To put that in perspective, debt service alone consumed over half of royal revenue. Imagine running a business where more than 50% of your income goes straight to paying interest, and you're still borrowing more. That was France. And while Versailles glittered with gold, ordinary people bore the weight. The tax system exempted the richest classes, the nobility and clergy, from direct taxation. The first and second estates, representing a tiny fraction of the population, paid little or nothing. The third estate, the commoners who made up more than 90% of the country, paid land taxes, salt taxes, church tithes, and countless feudal dues. Bread accounted for up to 70% of a worker's daily spending, and when grain harvests failed in the late 1780s, prices doubled. In Paris, riots broke out over bread long before the storming of the Bastille. To the people, taxation without relief and inflation without mercy made survival itself a political issue. The monarchy tried reform, but privilege blocked the way. Finance Minister Anne Robert Jacques Turgot proposed sweeping changes, abolishing tax exemptions, modernizing revenue collection, and cutting court spending. Nobles resisted. Jacques Necker, another reformer, tried to increase transparency by publishing the royal accounts, unheard of at the time. His reports showed deficits so deep they rattled public confidence further. By the late 1780s, successive ministers warned King Louis XVI that the monarchy was bankrupt. But every attempt to fix the system ran into the same wall. The nobility and clergy refused to give up privileges, and the king lacked the will to force them. By 1788, the monarchy could not secure loans on reasonable terms. Creditors demanded sky-high interest or refused to lend altogether. The government defaulted on payments to contractors and soldiers. That year, a severe grain shortage pushed bread prices to record highs, igniting hunger across the country. In desperation, Louis XVI summoned the Estates General in 1789, calling together representatives of the clergy, the nobility, and the people. It was the first time in more than 150 years that this assembly had been convened. Ostensibly, it was to solve the fiscal crisis and approve new taxes. In reality, it opened the floodgates of revolution. The people of the Third Estate realized the truth. The crisis wasn't just about numbers on a balance sheet. It was about a system designed to keep them poor while the privileged classes grew rich. When their grievances were ignored, they declared themselves the National Assembly. Soon after, the Bastille fell. The revolution had begun. But what most history books leave out is this. The Bastille didn't fall because of ideology alone. It fell because the French financial system collapsed under its own contradictions. Revolutions may begin with ideals, but they always run on money. Once the monarchy was toppled, the new revolutionary government inherited the same old problem: an empty treasury and a mountain of debt. The people expected liberty, equality, and bread. The reality was hunger, unpaid soldiers, and creditors circling like vultures. The revolution could not survive on slogans alone. It needed cash. And so, the National Assembly turned to what looked like a brilliant solution: confiscate the lands of the Catholic Church and use them as the foundation of a new currency. In 1790, the revolutionary government issued assignats, paper money backed by those vast confiscated lands. At first, it seemed like financial genius. France was rich in land but short on liquidity. By monetizing church property, the state could circulate wealth, pay debts, and stabilize the economy. Assignats were marketed as the people's money, a democratic alternative to the old royal system. Citizens embraced them, believing that this was a clean break with aristocratic privilege. For a brief moment, confidence returned. But paper money has a curse. Once politicians see that it works a little, they can't resist printing more. The first issue of Assignats was manageable, but the government quickly fell into the trap of issuing far beyond the value of the land backing it. What began as a limited solution became an open floodgate. By 1792, billions of livres in assignats were circulating. Inflation accelerated. The more the government printed, the less the currency was worth. By 1793, the assignat had lost more than half its value. By 1795, it was practically worthless. People carried stacks of paper to buy a single loaf of bread. Farmers hoarded grain, refusing to trade it for notes that evaporated in value overnight. Shopkeepers refused to accept them. Trust in the currency collapsed. To make matters worse, assignats became a target of counterfeiting. Foreign powers hostile to the revolution, Britain chief among them, deliberately flooded France with forged assignats, accelerating the collapse of confidence. Economic war was waged not only on battlefields, but through the destruction of money itself. The social consequences were devastating. Urban workers saw wages obliterated by inflation. Savings melted away. Soldiers and civil servants were paid in paper that lost value before it could be spent. Riots broke out in markets as bread once again became unaffordable. The revolution, born in the name of economic justice, had unleashed a new injustice: hyperinflation. The government's answer was price controls. But those failed too. Instead of stabilizing supply, they pushed trade underground. Farmers refused to bring grain to market. Black markets flourished. And with inflation came paranoia. Radical leaders like Robespierre turned economic failure into political terror. Those accused of hoarding grain, speculating, or undermining the currency were branded as enemies of the revolution. Thousands were executed, not for plotting against liberty, but for failing to play along with a broken economy. The guillotine became not only a tool of political justice, but also a tool of economic control. Inflation had mutated into blood. By 1796, assignats were so discredited that they were abandoned altogether. In their place came a new form of paper money, the mandats, which collapsed just as quickly. France lurched from one failed experiment to another, each promising salvation, each delivering deeper ruin. The revolution had promised freedom, but when it came to money, it delivered chaos. And yet, this story is not unique. If it sounds familiar, it's because we've seen it repeated throughout history. Weimar Germany in the 1920s printed marks until they were worth less than the paper they were printed on. Zimbabwe in the 2000s issued trillion-dollar notes that couldn't buy groceries. Even today, central banks flood economies with liquidity whenever crises strike, convincing themselves that printing can solve structural problems. The French Revolution shows us the pattern clearly. Printing money buys time, but it never buys stability. By the mid-1790s, France was financially broken. The promise of Assignats had ended in hyperinflation. The revolution had lost its economic legitimacy. And in that vacuum, a new kind of leader would rise. Napoleon Bonaparte. By the mid-1790s, France was exhausted. The monarchy was gone, the nobility scattered, the clergy dispossessed. Yet the financial nightmare had only deepened. The paper money that was supposed to liberate the people had destroyed their savings. Inflation had turned bread into a luxury and survival into a daily struggle. The guillotine had silenced dissent, but it could not silence hunger. And in that chaos, one truth became impossible to ignore. Revolutions may overthrow kings, but without economic stability, they devour themselves. It was in this climate that Napoleon rose. He wasn't just a brilliant general, he understood order, both military and financial. When he seized power in 1799, one of his first priorities was to stabilize money. In 1800, he created the Bank of France, restoring confidence in currency and credit. The message was simple: chaos ends when money is trusted again. The deeper lesson is this: financial systems are the skeleton of political power. If that skeleton is weak, nothing else can hold the system together. And this is not just history. Look around today. The patterns are still there. Debt is rising. Money is being printed. Inflation is returning. And as always, the public pays the price. If you made it this far, like the video and subscribe. Because on this channel, we don't just talk about history. We help you understand the world you're living in.